Welcome to the old man's corner. Pull up a chair and a cup of coffee and come on in. Welcome. Welcome to part 2 of Small Town Standouts. I was reminded by a friend after watching the last video that I had left out a few people that were really standouts in the small community in which I grew up in. One of the more ones that she reminded me of was a man named Stanley. Stanley was an auto mechanic. He had his own little shop there where I live, in the neighborhood where I lived, and it kind of little shop and as well as a salvage type yard. He's a very friendly guy most of the time, unless you bothered him while he was working. He would often do, some work for free or for little money. He was an interesting guy. He drove, I think, an old '60 Chevy, and it was always full of car parts and different things, and there's only room to maybe fit somebody in the front seat with him if he took anybody anywhere. And his house was a very modest house. It was siding was kind of rough, and his shop was just an old, like, tin metal barn right there next to it, metal building with a couple of bays in it. And he jacked up his vehicles. He didn't have a lift or anything like that, but he also had, like I said, the whole front yard and stuff, and the backyard was full of parts and different things. He was known in the neighborhood from the kids because a lot of people, you can go over and ask Stanley if you needed some money, and he'd either loan it to you or he'd give it to you. And he was friendly in that way, He also, like I said, he would work on vehicles for little or no money at times too. And he could also find parts for you and that type of stuff. And him and his family were known in the neighborhood. They were good people. A little awkward. Most of the time he was always kind of greasy and oily, and he was in his work clothes about every time you saw him. And he chewed tobacco, and he had a few missing teeth, so he was kind of an odd looking guy, and he was pretty short, but he was a good guy, so I thought it better. He's pretty well known, so I needed to add him in there too. In the town I grew up, also, there was a state hospital that was just set a little bit out of town. And often some of the residents that lived there would come into town to work. They would come out and they'd ride their bikes in. We had this one guy, his name was Bud, we called him Bud. The people that worked in town always had to wear an orange vest. And that way we all knew where they were from. They were from the state hospital. Some of them came in and had odd jobs they worked at, and some of them just came in and did things like walking around cleaning yards, or picking up pop bottles and cans and things like that. And I know some of them probably had jobs. I don't know that all of them did. I know that the gentleman I'm talking about is Bud. Bud, he rode an old Schwinn bicycle. It was kind of a brown with a white stripe on it. It was one of the older ones, and he rode around quite a bit there in town. You'd see him come down about every day. And he was kind of a gruff-looking fella. He was really kind of dark-skinned. He was like a real dark tan. He's had a scruffy-looking beard face, not much of a beard, and scraggly hair. And of course, he always wore kind of scraggly clothes, but he seemed to be a nice guy. He didn't talk much. We didn't get to really talk to him much, but you'd see him around and about, and I'm sure he was doing things for the community that a lot of us as children had no clue what he was doing. That was one of the interesting people there. And in our town, we also had this place called Peerless Bakery, and the guy that owned it and ran it was Merle Hatteberg. And it was a nice bakery. You could smell it for blocks, and he'd be there early in the early at not late well late at night or early in the morning, cooking up fresh donuts and pastries and stuff like that. And I had some family members that worked for him every once in a while. And there's this one guy that there in town. He was albino, had real white skin and pinkish eyes, and he worked for Merle at night. He wasn't out and about much in the daytime. I didn't know him personally. I'd seen him because he'd be out walking. Because as a kid in that town, we were often out at night walking up around Main Street and all that stuff. And that's where the bakery was at. So we'd seen him. I know my nephew, he said that he had worked with him at one time. So he was just an interesting guy there that you didn't get to see very often in most towns. As I got older, there was, and I worked in the nursing field, there was a lady I met. She was a professor at Southwestern College. She taught art and those type of things. And her name was Sujin Kovacevic. And she was most known around our town because the First National Bank there on Main Street, and when you walked inside, there was these magnificent murals that had been, someone had created, and that was her. She was in there, and she painted and created all the murals that were in the First National Bank. And there's many times you saw her picture in the paper as she was in there. It took years to paint all those things. That picture's in there of her in there painting and all this stuff. She was an interesting person. She did various other things that I think she was well known for. She had a lot of her work published in different books too, of her art and stuff. But she's just one that I'd actually met as well. And Merle Hatteberg had a son. His name was Larry Hatteberg, and he's from Winfield. He became he reported the ag news at one of the news and radio stations up in Wichita. And Larry was pretty well known around there. He also, when he was working as a reporter and such, he created what was called Hatteberg's People. He would get out and travel around the state and meet interesting people in different places, and he'd put his Hatteberg's People on TV, and you could get to see some of the different places and people that are that were in Kansas that were of interest to him, and obviously enough to put them on TV and such. Well, these are just a few more, though, people that were interesting in our town that made a mark in one way or another, at least remained in our memories, in my memories, and others, obviously. So, just a short message again. If you had people like this in your town and you want to share their stories or your stories with them, let me know. Give us a comment down here and talk about them. And if you knew other people in this town that you knew, let me know, and I see if I remember them. I'll try to bring them up in another video. But I thank you for sharing all the things that you share, and I thank you for watching these videos. And just know that I love you. And I'll just talk to you later. Have a great day.